So it seems that Games Workshop is finally starting to lift the lid on their new 40k but indoors expansion. Let's talk through their recent preview for 40k boarding actions, and whether or not this whole expansion is looking any good. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today Games Workshop have dropped their first official preview for the new 40k boardings actions minigame. A new expansion and a different way to play 40k and shaking things up a bit. I feel like at least a fair few people are fairly curious to try it out. Warhammer 40k battles, but indoors, set aboard a Space Hulk. They mentioned that this thing was coming in a preview, I believe it was in early December. We know that the concluding campaign type books for 9th edition are going to be these Arks of Omen books, a series of 4 different books, starting with Abaddon and then Angron and Vashtor, with a Xenos book at the end. Rather than having a whole bunch of supplemental rules for the different factions in these books this time round, they've decided instead that the main selling point is going to be this supplemental expansion that you can play if you want to, but if you've got no interest, you don't have to pick it up. Though it seems plausible that we might see some rules for some specific models within the book, like that Azrael datasheet that we had leaked. In terms of the actual releases of the books now, we've got a few more details. The Abaddon book will have the core rules for its Arks of Omen shipboard battles, and then the other ones will add some expansions to it. They mentioned that the Angron book would have things like extra stratagems, relics and warlord traits specific to the different factions. Broadly speaking, the general idea of this 40k boardings actions expansion is that you play 40k but it's set indoors on a Space Hulk. It does mean that you might need some slightly different terrain for it. Apparently they're coming out with this boarding actions terrain section with a whole load of shipboard walls, bulkheads and things like that. It looks like the stuff that came out for Kill Team in those boxes will be very usable as well. Apparently the core mechanics are going to keep basically most of the rules of standard 40k, but just trim out a fair bit of extraneous stuff, and armies will be very limited as to what sort of things that you can bring. I'm sure that monsters and vehicles won't be allowed to be playing in these shipboard hangars. There might be other restrictions as well on jump infantry or other big models. I think in one of their previous previews they mentioned that the game mode will be tailored at around about 500 point skirmish games. I don't know if that's just the initial offering in the Abaddon book, and then the future ones will maybe expand things a bit more to bigger battles inside. I guess to an extent you probably do want to keep things somewhat small and manageable. I feel like really big sprawling battles across these Space Hulks might be kind of hard to manage if you've only got a few choke points where your units and models can interact with each other. In any case, they previewed a fair few of the core mechanics of how the game would work, and it is kind of interesting stuff, I think. First up, unlike in Warhammer 40k, where the walls and things are maybe a little bit of an abstraction, you have units holed up in ruins and things, but they can be fighting in and around them, representing models going through doorways, fighting through windows and things. The actual terrain is going to be very granular here. You need to measure distances around walls and through bulkheads and things, and that includes for things say like command auras and psychic powers and stuff, even if you don't need line of sight to the models that you're affecting. I guess it means that you could have a commander that's commanding troops in one corridor, but even if they're just separated by a big wall from some others, they wouldn't be able to command those guys as well. It also looks like you wouldn't be doing any sort of fighting through walls. And again, that's a little bit different to standard 40k, where you have the 1-inch engagement range, so you might have some forces fighting on the one side of a wall, but still be able to engage models in combat, as it's a bit of an abstraction and basically represents them storming through doors and things like that. I guess they can afford to be a little bit more fine-tuned with the terrain rules if they are going for slightly smaller games, and you've got enough time and inclination to think about the positioning of every single model. As well as that, they've got mechanics for hatchways as well. They're on quite a few of those terrain kits for the kill team things. Apparently they can be open and closed via an action. I guess that might be doing something like sacrificing your movement for it, and then maybe you might be able to shoot and charge afterwards. While the hatchways are closed, they count as solid walls, but when they're open, they basically count as free terrain that you can move through. Another interesting change was to their shooting rules as well. Firstly, they made the kind of obvious clarification that barrage weapons don't work, mentioning that if you fire a mortar indoors, it's probably not going to get you very far. I can see why you wouldn't be able to be doing bombardments like that, but things like tower smart missiles and things won't be working either. You'll have to have direct line of sight. Perhaps more interesting than that, though, is that line of sight is going to be able to be blocked both by friendly and enemy models. You're not going to be able to draw lines of sight across other enemies' bases to shoot other ones, so you could have some units that are shielding other ones just with their sheer mass. Probably going to be fairly easy to do in more cramped corridors where you might only need 1 or 2 models to achieve that. They said that friendly models can do that just as well as enemies, and it sounds like you might even be able to block your own shooting with models in your own unit, not something that's normal in Warhammer 40k. Though it's not 100% impossible that they might have an exception that Games Workshop hasn't mentioned. In this example on the right, they said that Model A could shoot at the unit that Model B and C are in, but wouldn't be able to shoot at the units that Models D and E are in, as Models B and C are blocking his way. Overall, that would be a bit of a reduction in the power of shooting units in general if you couldn't really bring all your guns to bear, and it's very easy for the enemy to choose exactly what you're going to have to shoot at, maybe taking their most tanky or expendable units first, and then perhaps having something more nasty lying in wait to strike the next turn. Another interesting mechanic that they previewed was the cover rules. Again, that kind of goes with shooting, and apparently the way that this is going to work is on a per model basis. It depends how much of the model's base that you're firing at gets obscured as to whether or not they gain the benefit of cover. In this example, when the Intercessor is trying to fire at the Necrons with the pistol, Model D wouldn't get any cover because you've just got line of sight to it. You can't shoot Model B because it's through a wall. But Model C would get a cover save as he can draw line of sight to part of his base but not all of it. It's partly hidden behind that bulkhead or column. They mentioned that it might make things just a little bit easier to take up defensive positions. Say for example, you could have a couple of units defending corners. You could put it in a position where part of them would pretty much always be hidden if enemies were trying to shoot them down a corridor or something. Apparently there's more terrain rules that we don't know about. We'll have to wait and see on that score, I suppose. Otherwise, at least compared with regular 40k, it does look like a lot of the sections of the codex are going to be a bit more restricted, particularly stratagems, relics and warlord traits were the things that they called out. Apparently from the basic expansion rules from the Abaddon book, basically any stratagems from your codex just aren't going to be allowed. You're only allowed to use the core ones that they've got there, your standard command reroll, your counter-offensive to interrupt in combat, and insane bravery to stop models running away. That'd be really quite a big deal for some armies. Some units just get massively better because they've got access to interesting stratagems that make them better in certain situations, or a bit more survivable or dangerous. I guess it just really puts the focus on what the individual datasheets of the models can do, as opposed to any augmented abilities. I think that would take at least a bit of getting used to. You wouldn't be using transhuman physiology on your Primaris Marines, and you couldn't use things like, say, excruciating frequencies on Noise Marines to get mortal wounds, or have Eldar fire and fading, so move shoot moving into a better position. Definitely kind of interesting to see Warhammer 40k in action with minimal stratagems about, but perhaps does feel like a change that it affects some armies much more than others. Apparently the Angron book will be getting some faction-specific stratagems and things, ones that are tailor-made for these boarding actions. For example, we've got one called Heads Down for 1 CP for Astra Militarum core units. This one means that that unit gets to be ignored for the purposes of blocking line of sight for your own friendly models. So say for example, I guess you could have 2 infantry squads, one out the front, fire off some las guns, then use this and fire off the squad behind them in a second volley. That one sounds like it's got quite a good feel to it, firing in multiple ranks, and could perhaps be kind of interesting for something like some standard guardsmen out the front, taking some bullets for some Kazakin behind them, who are using them as human shields. Another one that's previewed is one called Pile Through for the Orcs. That one's 1 CP, and this one comes into effect when either you or your opponent opens a hatch in the movement phase. Orcs units that happen to wind up in engagement range now count as having made a charge due to that hatch being opened. I guess that'd mean that you get the chance to fight first potentially. I guess if you had some enemies in defensive positions behind the hatchway, then it got opened, they'd normally get to strike first otherwise, so this could give you a decent advantage and allow you to get the jump on the opponent. Kind of feel like that one might be a bit niche though. It kind of means that both yours and your opponent's units have to have chosen to be on either side of a hatchway, and that might just not come up all that much. Otherwise though, warlord traits and relics will apparently be limited to specific ones from this game mode. Again, I'd suspect that there might well be coming later on from things like Angron or the Vashtor supplements, and there's plenty more details that Games Workshop haven't shown off yet. They say specifically Overwatch changes, actions, missions and terrain will all have some interesting rules coming for them, so I guess we'll have to cover those when Games Workshop tells us about them. Overall, just in the previewed rules that Games Workshop has talked about at the moment, it sounds like you're going to really want things that are really quite tough and have either good shooting or melee at close range, with long range units kind of being a bit redundant. It seems very unlikely that they'll be changing points costs and things for this game mode, so perhaps there's no real point in paying a premium for things to have long range when you could just invest in the usually slightly cheaper and more efficient close range stuff, which unlike regular 40k doesn't have to worry too much about getting shot from miles away as it crosses the board. I have a feeling that slow stompy elites with really good armour might be particularly well favoured here, and potentially annoying expendable chaff units to frustrate those elites. Maybe if you could move something up really quite quickly and get in their way, you might well be able to hold them up for a turn in the narrow choke points of the corridors. I have a feeling that armies in general might just be grinding themselves down a little bit slower against the opponent than in regular 40k. you're only going to be having a few models and units that can engage each other properly each turn, and that might mean that battles might be a bit more of a slow war of attrition, as opposed to the fairly fast affairs of 40k. For that reason, I wonder whether or not it'll still be 5 turns, or Games Workshop might up the turn count to a few more. Otherwise, I feel like a lot of armies are going to either win or lose big by what units and options they can actually take. Armies like Imperial and Chaos Knights are just going to be 100% unplayable in this, and it might make a really big deal to some factions as to whether or not some core units are allowed. Say for example, Tau Crisis Suits are really quite big bulky jump infantry, and we'll have to see the actual unit list of restrictions as to whether or not they could even take to the field. I feel like Tau in general might just struggle with this quite a bit, with a lot of ranged units, several of which just don't really want to be too close to the enemy. Again, with the stratagems and things, armies that really relied on stratagems to give themselves a fair bit of power won't be liking this too much. Maybe for example, Leagues of Votann with their stratagems giving them a whole load of advantages might be a bit less powerful than they are in regular 40k, and also with things like judgment tokens needing line of sight from a Carl to hand them out, again that might not be ideal. I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes though as to whether or not this game mode will be any good, or whether you think it's just going to be a bit of a flash in the pan and then forgotten. I feel like from these initial previews, most of the decisions that they've made seem pretty sensible. The majority of the rules are going to be following standard Warhammer 40k ones, which means that you don't need to completely relearn an army to be able to play it, and so far the restrictions and things do feel like they make sense for close quarters corridor fighting, and the size of the games being quite small might again actually make it a little bit more ease of access. I guess perhaps one of the most annoying things to get together might be a terrain set. I suppose you might be able to custom rig something with a bit of cardboard if you fancy. Kind of depends on how much terrain and what sort of layouts they're recommending for a standard game. I guess some players might well be turned off as well by their armies being particularly bad at this game mode, if that turns out to be the case. People who primarily play knights aren't exactly going to be jumping on this, and if the bulk of your army revolves around vehicles or models that can't be taken in this game mode, again that's going to exclude a bunch of players and some of their factions. Overall though, I do feel this is probably going to do a little bit better than say that Apocalypse expansion that they had. A few people did quite like that, but it just really didn't take on. That game mode introduced a whole load of new rules for basically every unit in the game, plus some quite specific and specialised kit that you needed to get together for it, like some different sized dice, which not every 40k player has hanging around. I feel like for an optional expansion like this, you both need the game to be good and also fairly easy to jump into without too much of a learning curve, otherwise a lot of people just aren't going to bother. Overall though, I certainly will be tempted to try it out for a few games. I think it should be fun to have a different flavour of Warhammer 40k, and kind of interesting to see them adapting their rule sets to a different environment, almost feeling like a bit of an upscaled kill team across a Space Hulk. Could be fun for some narrative missions aboard close confines, and I have a feeling that quite a lot of people are going to try it out and get some good fun from it. My guess is this will be a bit more of a novelty thing, good fun for a little bit, but then probably dropped by all but a few fans. It doesn't sound like Games Workshop are probably going to support this into the far future, unlike things like Kill Team and Necromunda. I feel like it's one of these expansions that's going to be a big thing for a few months, and then become a bit of a relic of 40k's past. I don't know whether their core rules or anything will be adaptable to 10th edition. My guess would be that it probably won't be written with 10th edition in mind, but you might well be able to make the rules work with a little bit of adaptation. I'm looking forward to getting a few games in though. Should be fun to have some elite infantry skirmishing with some alien horrors and having to think a bit more about positioning of each model. In any case, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. What do you make of these initial new rules? What do you like or dislike? And would you be tempted to give this game a go? If you've enjoyed the video, I'll certainly be trying to cover any more news of 40k's expansions coming up. Sounds like Games Workshop should have a few more previews for this on the way at some point. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to keep up with Games Workshop's news and a bit of discussion around it. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. It is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying, any support is enormously appreciated. In any case, it's links down in the video description if you're interested, and a massive thank you for listening either way. I'll hope to see you guys next time.